Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech Asia. It's Tuesday, March 31st, 2015, and I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. A little later on today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Dr. Loretta Chen. Dr. Chen is something of a Renaissance woman, currently serving as Director of Creative and Business Development for the Activation Group in Singapore, but she's also a theater director and author and a scholar as well. Dr. Chen and I will be discussing the life and times of the late Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father. Kuan Yew passed away this past week at the age of 91. Before we begin, though, I'd like to thank all of our loyal and regular viewers for your cards and letters over the past week. And as a reminder, in addition to our streaming broadcast, our program will be uploaded to YouTube later, so you can share the link with all your colleagues and loved ones. And as always, if you have any Asia-related events to publicize, please contact me at keiththinktech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions and comments directly via Twitter at KCCGeography. Now onto our news summary. Now onto our weekly news summary of important events in Southeast, in and around Asia. First, to Southeast Asia, where in Cambodia this week, Kem Sokha, Vice President of the opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party, has been summoned to appear in Phnom Penh Municipal Court a week after being threatened with a lawsuit by Prime Minister Hun Sen. Kem Sokha's attorney, Chin Chan, said that the summons is likely related to a violent demonstration that took place between July of 2013 and July of 2014, in which several members of the opposition were arrested. The protests focused on government corruption and allegations of electoral fraud during the Cambodian general election of 2013, in which Prime Minister Hun Sen was elected to his fourth term. The international non-governmental organization Human Rights Watch, along with opposition leader Sam Rainsy, alleged widespread election fraud, which the Cambodian government has denied. Hun Sen has been Prime Minister of Cambodia for 25 years. He previously served in the Khmer Rouge and later as Premier during the rule of the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party. Hun Sen's government has been responsible for the sale of 45% of the total landmass of Cambodia, primarily to foreign investors. Kem Sokha, on the other hand, has been a stalwart of Cambodia's opposition since 1993, when as a member of the when he was elected as a representative of the now defunct Buddhist Liberal Democratic Party. In 1999, he joined the Royalist Phun Sen Pek Party and was elected senator, but in 2001, he resigned his Senate seat. In 2007, he founded the Human Rights Party, which merged with the longtime opposition Sam Rainsy Party in 2012. After the merger, Kem Sokha became vice president of the new party, and in August of last year, he was elected first vice president of the National Assembly, the first opposition member of parliament to hold this post in Cambodia. Now on to East Asia. This week, there are a number of developments related to North Korea and her neighbors. Japan announced that it would extend sanctions against North Korea for 2 more years. These sanctions, which were set to expire in April, are in addition to sanctions that were imposed on North Korea by the United Nations and are in response to North Korea's kidnapping of numerous Japanese citizens over the course of several decades. In 2014, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that the sanctions would be relaxed in hopes that it would stimulate progress on resolving the kidnapping issue. But this past week, Tokyo accused Pyongyang of foot-dragging and obfuscation in relation to the kidnappings. North Korea says all of the Japanese citizens that were kidnapped have been either returned or have died, but Japan disputes this claim. Beginning in the 1970s, North Korea began kidnapping Japanese citizens as part of a plot to train spies in language and culture. North Korea also announced last week that it has detained 2 South Korean men on charges of espionage. A South Korean Protestant association announced that one of the men is a pastor and that he was carrying out missionary work for North Korean defectors in the Chinese port city of Dandong. North Korea's official media showed images of the 2 men and claimed that they were spies working for South Korea's National Intelligence Agency. Now on to South Asia. Several weeks ago, we reported on the brutal murder of Bangladeshi-American blogger and scholar Avijit Roy in Dhaka. This week, another blogger was hacked to death in Dhaka. This time, the victim was Washkar Rahman. Rahman was murdered near his home in Dhaka's Bangambari neighborhood. Rahman, 27 years old, blogged under the nom de plume of Kuchit Hashirchana, which translates as ugly duckling. A frequent subject of his writings was religious extremism, and he was particularly vocal in the wake of the murder of Avijit Roy. 2 students from an Islamic seminary have been arrested for the murder. They were apprehended near the scene of the crime, still wielding the meat cleavers they allegedly used to commit the murder. The suspects told the police that they targeted Rahman because of his anti-Islamic writing, but they also told police that they were not familiar with Rahman's work and that they were simply following the orders of someone that told them that killing Rahman was a religious duty. A 3rd suspect remains at large. The murders of Roy and Rahman have raised concerns about freedom of speech in Bangladesh. Now, on to our interview. Over the past week, Singapore has been mourning the loss of Lee Kuan Yew, considered to be the founder of modern Singapore as an independent state. Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923. He graduated with a law degree from Cambridge and returned to Singapore in the 1950s to practice law. He gradually became involved in politics, eventually founding the People's Action Party, which campaigned for the United Kingdom to grant independence to Singapore. Singapore merged with Malaysia in 1963, but separated from the Federation 2 years later in 1965, becoming completely independent. Lee Kuan Yew served as Prime Minister from 1965 to 1990, when he stepped down to assume a highly influential ministerial position. Lee Kuan Yew has always been somewhat of a controversial figure, but there is no doubt that he's one of the most influential statespeople of the 20th century. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the life and times and legacy of Lee Kuan Yew. So today, joining me in the studio, my guest this week is Dr. Loretta Chen, who currently serves as Director of Creative and Business Development for the Activation Group in Singapore. Dr. Chen earned her master's degree at the University of London and was the first PhD graduate in theater studies from the UCLA National University of Singapore. She pioneered the creative communications drama and the creativity, innovation, and enterprise programs at Singapore Polytechnic and has served as an adjunct professor at the National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technology University in Singapore. She is also one of Singapore's most prolific directors, having received more than 10 Life Theatre Award nominations, including Best Director. She's directed performances of The Swimming Instructor, Postcards from Rosa, The Vagina... I knew I wasn't going to be able to pull that off.
It is a tough word.
The Vagina Monologues and numerous other productions. She's also the author of the autobiography Woman on Top, The Art of Smashing Stereotypes and Breaking All the Rules. Dr. Chen, thank you so much for being on the program today. I hope that you were comfortable on the ThinkTech jet that brought you here from Singapore today.
Oh, completely.
Thank you for joining
I'm
us.
also very comfortable saying the word vagina. If that helps.
I thought about that all day. I've got to say this with a straight face, professionally,
Sure.
and I thought I was going to be able to do it, but I didn't.
I do have a story about that, but you can ask me about that later, anytime.
Maybe if we have time at the end of the show. But thank you for joining us. And today what we're going to focus on is Lee Kuan Yew, and you really bring a unique perspective, being a theater director and having kind of matured as an artist under the Lee Kuan Yew regime. So let's start with the questions. In 1998, Lee Kuan Yew wrote that some countries are born independent, some achieve independence. Singapore had independence thrust upon it. Now, I think that many people in the West are probably not familiar with the turbulent beginnings of Singapore, where it came from, nor how difficult it was to forge an independent state of Singapore in between Malaysia and Indonesia. So can you describe a little bit about Singapore's independence drama?
First off, I'm not a historian, but in 1819, that's where, for all of us that went to school, we all know that that's the start of the founding of modern Singapore. In 1819, obviously, Sir Stamford Raffles sailed and came from Britain to Singapore, and that started 144 years of British rule in Singapore. Except for a brief moment when the Japanese occupied us from 1942 to 1945. And I think those were the years that I think Lee Kuan Yew obviously was a young, feisty 20-something, and those were the years that I think, and I read his memoirs as well, that most affected him as a young man. Because first you have an unprecedented number of years that the British was there in Singapore. And then when the Japanese came, I think nobody then thought that we would fall to the Japanese, because when I say we, I mean Singapore and Singaporeans. No one thought that we would fall. And in 1942, we fell to the Japanese, and they continued to rule us until 1945. And I remember that too, because my mother was born in 1938, and she was not allowed to speak Mandarin, and she could only, I think when she was going to school as a very young girl, she had to speak Mandarin, but I digress. So nobody thought we would fall to the Japanese, and I think for young Lee Kuan Yew, belly full of fire, I think that would have really changed his worldview.
Sure.
So you had peace under the British, and then you have the Japanese coming in until 45, and that whole started a whole a turbulent period in Singapore, leading to the establishment of the PAP, or the People's Action Party, in 1959. And thereafter, when I say we again, I mean the government, we campaigned for independence, because I think what it was we didn't want to be pushed around anymore. First we had the British coming in, and then we thought we were safe with them. And then the Japanese came in, and we had 3.5 years of really, really tough times, to say the least. And then in 1961, Lee Kuan Yew then thought that the best way for us to move ahead as a young, fledgling country was to join forces with our biggest neighbor then, which was Malaysia. We had no water, even though we're an island. And we've always been told, even when I was going to school, that we have no natural resources, even though we're surrounded by water, but not a drop to drink.
Right.
With that, I think it was his greatest dream that we would be united with Malaysia, which would then be our hinterland. So he fought all his adult life for us to be part of the Federation.
Right.
In 1963, the merger was proposed. In 1961, the merger was proposed. In 1963, there was a merger.
Right.
But before we knew it, we were expelled from the Federation of Malaysia. So I think most people think that we fought for independence, but we didn't fight for independence. We were like the proverbial child that was chastised and said, well, get out. And so we were expelled in 1965. And just to give you the context of this expulsion, we have no water, we have no infantry. I think at that point in time, we probably only had, I think on record, like 800 men in the infantry. We had no other resources but our people. And we had independence thrust upon us. As you
I think that most people don't realize that, well, two things, that Singapore was part of the Malaysian Federation for a couple of years. But also, it's kind of ironic when we think about it today, because Singapore's economic growth has really outpaced Malaysia's economic growth. But Singapore, that was a contentious relationship. And Singapore was indeed kicked out in 1965. Which I don't think that many people are aware of that, but also, you know, during the 1960s, there was the turbulence between Malaysia and Indonesia and Southeast Asia. There was no ASEAN at that time.
No, until 1967, no.
And the neighbors didn't really get along with one another. So it was a really turbulent place to be, and Singapore is right there in the middle of it. And so things changed over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s. And to say that Singapore has undergone this a radical transformation over the next 60 years is kind of an understatement. So, it's still changing. And the personality of Singapore has changed as well. Now, you grew up, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1980s and 1990s. I don't want to date you here.
Oh, I'm very proud of my
age. You grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s. Can you tell us how you experienced these changes during your childhood, your adolescence, and how it shaped you as a professional?
First of all, I'll just come right out and say my age, because then it's easier for me to work through the years, right?
All right.
So I'm 39 this year. So growing up in the 80s and 90s, I always refer to, because we're going back to Lee Kuan Yew as well, I always remembered him as being like the father figure. I think going to school, I think we always refer to him as like the founder of modern Singapore.
In a good way, or
in a very respectful way. I think we're taught to be very respectful. I think the one thing that I think most people have a misconception of Singapore is that we were hugely confusion, even though I think we were trying to espouse democratic values. I think Lee Kuan Yew has never shied away from saying that he is very Asian at heart, and he coined the term Asian values. And I would argue that he espoused very Confucian values as well. So it was almost a paternalistic way of running the country.
Sure.
All the literature and all the jargon and everything that you would know refers to him as like the father, as paternalistic. It's like dad knows best.
Yeah.
Sort of a rubric. But that was when I was a lot younger. You don't really think about these things when you're a teenager. When I started engaging more in my early 20s, I think by that time Lee Kuan Yew was senior minister. He wasn't making a lot of decision making because he had stepped down as prime minister, but the legacy of his policies still remained. And I remember then that it was strict, it was authoritarian, we had corporal punishment, we still have all of this, and I think everyone in the West knows that we caned Michael Fay, we banned the import and export of chewing gum.
Well, when you use the word authoritarian,
right.
at the time, was there for you and your cohort, your
right.
friends,
yeah.
was there a consciousness that this is an authoritarian environment?
Really good question. I think when you're probably around like 15 or 16 or 17, you're just kind of happy to break all your own rules in school, look cool in school. I don't think there was a consciousness of culture, like that you're surrounded by culture. Like this was just the life you live in. And
Sure.
remember then, I think it's really hard for us to think of a world without the internet and without Google, where you could just get online and Google everything, right? So back then, this was the world we lived in. You didn't travel too much. Then we weren't incredibly wealthy, and even if I did travel, I wouldn't be able to contextualize everything. So this was just the world we lived in. I don't think there was a conscious questioning until I got to the university, and I think that was when I think my consciousness started, as with most of us, was getting an education, and then suddenly I think once those rose-tinted blinkers are removed, you can't ever unsee again. And when you start looking at other democracies and other countries, and then you start gaining access to other sorts of
Sure.
information, and then you're like, oh, we kind of have it different from other people, right? Because until then, your only reference was your school textbooks, like the literature that you're given, the newspapers, which I think would then be quite interesting later on if we do get there to talk about how our elections have shifted as well because of the entire social media and the entire climate. But back then, no, the only access we had to information was our national newspapers, our national radios, our schools, our textbooks, what our teachers fed us, the songs we sang, and all of that. But when you get to university, you start reading about other people, other cultures, other countries. You start, as I started traveling.
Sure.
And that's when you realize, oh, there is a lot of unhappiness with how Singapore was headed towards. And I started becoming more aware of the dissidents. But because prior to that, if you were just in school, you were sheltered from all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay. That's very, very interesting. We're going to take a break here.
Okay.
And we'll be right back in just a moment. Thank you for joining us at ThinkTech Asia. We'll be right back.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year it is on April 6th, 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
So,
Okay, here we
okay.
are. All right, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. My name's Keith Benninger. I'm your host, and today we're talking about the life and times and the legacy of Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew. And I'm joined in the studio today by Dr. Loretta Chen, who's joining us all the way from Singapore. Thank you for making the trip just to be on ThinkTech today.
Thank you.
A moment ago, we were talking about how Lee Kuan Yew, his policies, and the governance atmosphere in Singapore shaped your upbringing and shaped your development as a as an artist. And you mentioned Asian values, and in 1990. Lee Kuan Yew famously coined the term Asian values, and he used this to refer to Singapore's socio-political system, which prioritized stability and economic progress over individual freedoms. And the term was later used by Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia and Suharto in Indonesia to justify somewhat authoritarian policies and tacit rejection of Western concerns over human rights. And Lee Kuan Yew was known for that as well. The use of the term has waned somewhat since the Asian financial crisis. We don't hear Asian values as much as we did in the 90s. But it still persists. The idea still persists. It comes up in conversation like our conversation earlier. Now, from your perspective, is there actually such a thing as Asian values? What are they, and how should they be incorporated into the political system, if they should be?
Huge question, how much time we've got. But okay, we'll start with the Asian values. I think, yes, I think a lot of people like to say, no, there isn't, but I would think that there is. I think, like it or not, there is, or at least that's how I like to perceive it, and this is my own conception of it, right? That I think, and I have to take some liberties and separate, say, the West and the East and the West. So in the West, I think a lot of things is on a spectrum. You have good, bad, and there are polar opposites. It's always on a spectrum. Good here, bad there, black here, white there, or white here, black there, and everything's on a spectrum. In Asia, I think things exist in a dialectic. I think that's how we view the world, is our concept of the world. Good exists with bad, black exists with white, and that's symbolized with the wonderful yin-yang symbol, that we all sort of coexist in this thing. The whole concept of karma, yin-yang, it's all about dialectic. And I think the key thing of Asian values that I think Lee Kuan Yew took, again, I'm always taking it back because of the topic of conversation, was that he took the concept of Confucian values. And like it or not, people can agree or disagree, but the key premise was that the person was in service of a community. And that is where I think we have a huge distinction from the West, where the individual's own rights and personal freedoms were the most important.
Sure.
Whereas for the East, again, I'm not saying I'm agreeing or disagreeing, but just setting out the context for argument, for discussion, is that for us in Asia, the individual is seen only as a unit, as a function of. So it's the individual, the family, society, the world. And we're just part of this whole social fabric. And in order to govern your family, you first govern yourself. In order to govern the society, you govern the family. In order to govern the world, you govern your society. So I think everything is that sort of a worldview that I think shaped a lot of Lee Kuan Yew's view of the world and policies.
When you were growing up, and you mentioned how you went to college and it changed your viewpoint. Does that conception of Asian values that you just mentioned, does that accurately describe how things were when you were a youngster?
I think so. I think you don't think about these things until you're older. And then now you look back, you think, wow, you know, a lot of myself is premised on the concept of family, and the reason why I've been going back and forth between US and Singapore is because the only thing that's holding me sometimes to Singapore is this notion of my family.
Sure.
This whole notion of filial piety, my responsibility towards my family, my mother, my father. It's so part of me that it's hard to pull that apart of me. And you don't think about it until much later, until you're in a different context and you look at how other societies function, and you think, oh, there is a difference. Like it or not, there is.
Right.
So to get back to your question of how, I think there's so many questions here. First off, this concept of Asian values. Yes, I do think that in many ways, his notion of governing a country stems very much from Asian values. That his notion of a stable society means that there must be order, there must be structure.
Right.
And I think you know, like it or not, a lot of critics would rally against him on this, but the Singapore that he created during his time, and you rightly say the word regime, was very much based on these Confucian values where everything had to be an orderly system. So we can have freedom of speech, but within confines.
Sure.
We can have freedom of this and that, but within confines. And so with Lee Kuan Yew, I always refer to him as MM Lee, is that there was always a clear structure. There was always clear OB markers.
Right.
And that was how it was when we were growing up. And again, like I said, because when I was younger, I didn't engage as much. But when I was older then, in new government, when I think we had Goh Chok Tong as our prime minister, I could tell that the government, again, it was only with difference that I can see the difference, right? With the new government, and also because I was becoming more aware, I'm going back to a question about being the artist as well, and a professional, and how I engaged with that, was that I realized that the new government then was trying to open up, and they knew that it could not just stick with the older ways, a more authoritarian, hard-fisted way of running the country. They tried to open up, and in so doing, they tried to open up very slowly and gradually. And when I was most prolific as a director, I couldn't quite tell where the OB markers were,
Sure.
Which led to a couple of stories that I shared with you, because I think on the one hand, as an artist, one of the ministries that I have to work with most frequently would be the Ministry of Information and the Arts, or MICA, Ministry of Information, Culture and the Arts, or MICA. And I remembered as an artist, one of the interesting dialogues that I was constantly engaged with them was on where are the censorship boundaries, like what can I do or what can't I do. I think one of the interesting anecdotes I shared with you was that in one of the plays that I directed, one of my most prolific work called 251,
Right.
what had happened was there was a scene in there where the lead actress has to kiss another girl. And the censors were coming to me to ask me, well, is this a lesbian kiss? And I said, well, the two girls kissing. Well, and then they'll say, well, how long is a kiss? And then I remembered asking them, well, how many seconds does the lesbian kiss make? Like, if you tell me that the OB marker is 8 seconds, then I'll have them kiss for 7.
Right.
If
So
you
it's
say
not
6 seconds,
technically a lesbian kiss.
So
yeah.
you know, I mean, I know it sounds facetious and we were having a joke about it and a good laugh, but I think the point was, I think when we were trying to be more open and liberal, we didn't know where the markers were then. So when I was growing up as an artist, when I was most prolific as an artist, it was most interesting for me because I was constantly in a dialogue
Sure.
with the government, because the OB markers were nebulous. And I gave you an example with Lee Kuan Yew, it was a brick box. Like, you knew that it was a box.
Yes.
Right? If you knocked on it, you will hurt. You know.
Right.
And they're very clear markers. Later on, when it was a newer government, it was a glass box. Like, I didn't know where the box was. And am I knocking into it? Am I approaching it? I don't know. So that was my experience as an artist.
So there was a lot more ambiguity when Lee Kuan Yew kind of stepped into the background as as senior minister.
Yeah.
Or as what was the term he used? Is the MM term?
He later became minister mentor.
Minister mentor, yes. So now that brings up an interesting issue for me. From the artist's perspective, then,
Right.
it sounds like what you're describing, that it's easier for an artist to kind of find their place under Lee Kuan Yew, because even though it's authoritarian, you know the out of bounds or the OB markers. It's much easier to find your place there than it is under kind of this ambiguous government that followed Lee Kuan Yew.
I'm sorry, can I just cut you in right
Sure.
there, because I am not saying that. In fact, I disagree with saying that, because maybe it's who I am. I cannot ever propose to speak for someone else, because I don't know what it's like to be an artist under Lee Kuan Yew, because I was too young.
Right.
I was only an artist when it was under Goh Chok Tong, and more pertinently Lee Hsien Loong, because that was when I was in my 20s and 30s. And what I felt as an artist was that, or at least it's also me, right? I always believe I need to know my positionality, I need to know my sense of perspective, I need to be first and foremost self-reflexive. And for me as a person, I always think if you give me ambiguity, I'm going to take that margin and challenge it as frontier.
Sure.
If you give me an adversity, I'm going to take that as opportunity. So for me as an artist, when I was doing a lot of my work during that time between about 2005 or 2002 to about 2010, of a good decade, there was a lot of ambiguity, and that I completely agree with you. That was very well put. sees that as an opportunity to negotiate, to push envelopes, to raise questions and say, well, if this wasn't put in black and white, in which case then I can then question because it's not put in black and white.
Sure.
For the artists during the Lee Kuan Yew regime, I have read, because I was never engaged as an artist then, I have read that they have been detained, that there were very clear boundaries, that people could be hauled up
Right.
for Marxist conspiracies or for this and that. So, and I have friends who have been detained without trial. So there were very clear markers or steps taken if you infringed certain laws
Yeah.
or boundaries. By the time I was an artist, I have to say that perhaps as a function of who I am as well, I often always consider everything that I do before I do it. I don't just decide to do a piece of work just for the sake of being controversial. I think one of the reasons why, because he's invited me to dialogue as well, is because in order to be heard, you need to be able to fully justify why you're even doing a piece of work. Sure. So I've actually been invited to dialogues with M.M. Lee and have had very engaging dialogues with him on censorship and homosexuality, because it's not just about picket fencing and just about saying something really stupid, but
Sure.
you had to have really
Finding
good
common ground.
Exactly, and then engaging with him on that.
Well, okay, so we're going to take a break, but
Okay.
I'd like to pick up on that thread in just a moment. But we'll be right back.
Okay.
This is ThinkTech Asia. Thank you for joining us. We'll be right back. Thank you very much.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. My name's Keith Bettinger, and we're talking about the life and times and legacy of Lee Kuan Yew today. And we're very, very privileged to have in the studio Dr. Loretta Chen. And we'll get back to the discussion now. Just a moment ago, we were talking about Asian values and artistic expression. What you seem to be describing is a conflict or friction between the role of an artist and the governmental system in Singapore. Now, I hesitate to use the word authoritarian. That term gets used all the time, but kind of the top-heavy government in Singapore.
Sure.
We'll
call this
now,
space, yeah.
so is that an accurate characterization of the relationship of the artist with the government? Is there an essential friction, an unavoidable friction, where you're always trying to push the boundaries against this authoritarian state or against this Asian value state? And if there is that going to continue in the future? So is this one of Lee Kuan Yew's legacies?
I think regardless of whether or not we're in Singapore or in the US, I think the artist will always inherently find him or herself in conflict with dominant culture. I think an artist, by nature of who we are, we're almost always going to find that we almost always want to hold up a mirror to society. And
sure, that's true, but there's a difference between being the friction between the artist and culture and the artist and the political system.
So I'm getting to that as well. But I think what is unique for us, particularly in Singapore, is that we're a very young nation with, as you say, independence trust upon us. And we have a very unique culture in that, on the one hand, we have people who are hugely afraid, hugely paranoid, and we live in a state where we are honestly afraid of confrontation. From my own personal experience, I think the average Singaporean, and I do know, and I know I'm taking some liberties here because there are lots of Singaporeans that I know who are incredibly eloquent, incredibly outspoken, but by and large, the exceptions prove the rule. And in general, Singaporeans do not know how to disagree, because we live in this state where everything is largely provided for us, and this authoritarian regime, as you say, makes a lot of Singaporeans afraid to speak up, and as a result, they do not know how to even agree to disagree. If they disagree, they would either shy away from a discussion, or they would sort of back off or remain silent and stoic.
Well, is that a product of the political system, or is that part of the quote-unquote Asian values?
I think it's a function of both. I mean, if we looked at how the Japanese behaved during the tsunami crisis, I think as the world watched and as the world wept for them, the Japanese remained so quiet and stoic. It was almost like we wanted to weep for them.
Right.
So
right.
I do think there is an element of that stoicism in the Asian, where we do not publicly demonstrate our affections or our emotions. My family is somewhat different, because we're always hugging and like, oh, I love you, and all. So back to the artist, I do think that the artist then in Singapore does play a really important role of being almost like the emotional arm of Singapore. I do think that this passing of Kuan Yew and the state of national mourning that we went through all week last week, I was crying too during the funeral, by the way, was that I think I would like to postulate that it's going to open up, aside from nationalism, we see that, I think it's going to open up a wave of sentimentality amongst Singaporeans in a way that we have not seen before, because the Singaporean is so used to keeping it all in. It's always money first, it's pragmatic first, we got to be very focused and everything, it's all about the order first, you got to hide your emotion, it's order first. And I think that's where the artist in Singapore finds difficulty in reconciling that, because for the artists, we need to hold up a mirror to society, and we need to speak what people really think and what people really feel. Right. And that's why we often have this tension. But for myself as an artist, and when I was doing a large part of my work, I seized that as an opportunity. I seized it as an opportunity in the sense that in a world where people were afraid of speaking up, in a world where people were afraid of displaying my emotions, I then created work that forced people to think, forced people to engage, forced people to either get angry or sad or mad or disgusted, because that was the only way to really reflect and think and learn if you allowed yourself to feel something, because most times the average Singaporean is always thinking. And not to say that's a bad thing, but I think that's a Singaporean to me thinking, is that you sometimes only get a real feeling of the world if you open your heart and your soul up. And that was why I was so adamant in being an artist, even though I started my career as an academic, as you rightly put it. And then I decided I wanted to be an artist, because a lot of your thought had to be governed by what you're feeling and sensing. And I think we had shut off a lot of that for economic reasons.
So then would it be accurate to say, do you view your role as challenging the order, or challenging the state, or helping the state to develop and grow?
Good question. I would like to see it as, and I always use this in everything that I do, as pushing margin as frontier, and seizing an adversity into an opportunity, because I think that the role, at least the role that I want to play, is to, one, critically engage, and that's me speaking as an academic, but also never fearing expressing what you feel, albeit, and this is Singaporean and me talking again, albeit trying to put it in pragmatic speak for the Singaporean audience, because the only way to get through to them is to show them that it's okay to feel, and that it's safe to feel, because the average Singaporean is almost afraid to do that. Right. Like me being on your show, for example, I would say, yeah, I'll be on your show because it's in Hawaii. I'm fine. But if I was in Singapore, and I will share with you this too, if I would still be on the show, because everybody knows I'm kind of fearless that way. But the point is, I remember they sent out a little circular, because I have my own radio show in Singapore, and they sent out a circular to say every person that's going to be on national media answering any question on Lee Kuan Yew, every answer had to be vetted. Like,
is that right?
You had to send it to us, and so we know what's going to be what you're going to be saying. So I remember that we had that little email or that little text coming through, and I remembered, oh yes, and it reminds me too that we will always be a state that will always have really firm government controls. It's a legacy that I think will live with us for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. That's a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Now we're going to transition. We're going to move on to our Cultural Corner segment.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to help me set this one up in just a moment.
Okay.
But the Cultural Corner has been on hiatus for the past couple of weeks, but it's back for today's show.
Yeah.
So on the program, we're featuring some snippets of the theatrical work that our guest, Dr. Loretta Chen, has been involved with in Singapore. Now, so can you take just a minute?
Okay.
Or a minute and a half to tell us, we're going to show your show reel from 2014. And what this is a montage of theatrical productions that you have produced and directed, if I'm not mistaken.
Directed last year. I don't produce, but yeah.
Directed. Can you tell us what we're going to see? Because there's a lot of stuff that we're about to see. So what's in this show reel?
I think there is different productions of different scales that I've done. I think there are snippets from Victor Victoria, which was, I think, one of the biggest musicals ever staged in Singapore. We had like a huge 24-5-piece orchestra. It was led by Iskandar Ismail, who's since passed away last year, a dear friend of mine. Laura Fiji, who is a famous jazz singer, she starred in the role of Victor Victoria that was obviously played by Julie Andrews. It was her last piece, last musical performance. So you'd see Victor Victoria, you'll see the Vagina monologues.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you said that you didn't say it with a straight face either. You're a big smile.
I know, right?
Typical.
And then I think you'll see snippets of 251, which is the play that got me in dialogue with M.M. Lee as well, which is a play based on the porn star Annabelle Chong. So that was hugely controversial then, and some other productions that I've done in my career, I think.
All right, so let's see what the show reel has in store, and as that comes on, well, we'll say goodbye. That's it for ThinkTech this week. But thank you for joining us, and I think we've really learned a lot. I want to express a special mahalo to my guest, Dr. Loretta Chen, for taking the time to be here today. Also, I want to thank express my appreciation for the studio crew here for making this show possible. We hope you'll join us again next week at 4 p.m. on Tuesday for another exciting episode of ThinkTech Asia. Mahalo, aloha, and ahui ho.
You come here often?
What? People are looking.
惨了！这要是这样之一，制毒、穿肠、烂肚、叫天不应，叫地不灵，痛到要死，百毒丸。别我见过了，别老别啊！别伤脑筋。你们全部都是坏蛋！
Once they got going, you couldn't stop them. Women secretly love to talk about their vaginas.
My husband beat the shit out of me. He wrapped my long black hair on his hand and jerked my head. I tried to get my son. That's not your son, he said, holding my hand, his hand. That's not your son anymore.
You cannot love a vagina unless you love hair.
Take your clothes off.
Oh, are you going to spank me? Yes, do if you wish. Oh, your psychotic experiences should be encouraged rather than thwarted or repressed. My darling, this is the way to a happy marriage. Yes, spank me hard.
I'm ready, doctor.
很傻。